On the 24th of August, 1961, around 80 kilometers or 50 miles north of Saigon, a large military aircraft, a C-47 to be precise, was flying low above the stretch of road known as Route 13, close to the village of Chon Tan. The C-47 was used extensively in the Second World War. It was not a particularly nimble plane, given that it was primarily designed for transporting personnel and supplies. But not on this occasion. This was a special test flight, an experiment really, being undertaken over a 4-kilometer stretch of Route 13, which had been personally selected by the leader of South Vietnam, Ngo Dinh Diem. The C-47's crew had been trained by a Captain Mario Kadori, and the specialized equipment that the plane had been fitted with was installed by Technical Sergeant Leon Rowe, both working in the Special Aerial Spray Flight Team of the United States Air Force. As you might have guessed, given the designation of that particular part of the Air Force, the bulky plane flying low over that stretch of bright green vegetation, covering the space adjacent to the highway, was not flying in supplies or dropping troops. It was ejecting quite a different substance altogether. A herbicide, or more specifically, a chemical defoliant, a substance that acts to affect the plant or tree it is sprayed on in a way that causes its leaves to die in a matter of days. The particular chemical used in this test was known as dinoxol and trinoxol, a mix of dichlorophenoxyacetic acid and trichlorophenoxyacetic acid, shortened to 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T, respectively. Any chemists listening will hopefully excuse my pronunciation and perhaps my superficial understanding of that part of the process, which we will expand upon in a few moments. But these kinds of chemicals had a long history thus far, used in agriculture and selectively by some militaries in the Second World War and in the Malayan War about a decade earlier. The primary goal of using these under the aim of defoliation is to either harm crops that were being used by the enemy or by stripping the enemy of the cover that a jungle can provide. Although this initial test was evaluated by the Americans as rather disappointing, President Diem was reportedly impressed, and according to one source, remained thereafter a staunch supporter of the defoliation program. Now, some listeners will be undoubtedly aware that I'm talking about what anyone even remotely familiar with America's war in Vietnam associates with Agent Orange. This initial test in August 1961 was deemed sufficient enough to begin the steps toward a widespread program of what was described by the Americans as a new chemical counterinsurgency tool. And as for most of the things we talk about in this series, it wasn't a decision that occurred out of nowhere, in a vacuum. And these circumstances actually dovetail quite nicely with my attempts to explain the origins of the Second Indochina War, particularly around the new presidency of John F. Kennedy. In the last episode, we spoke about his inauguration in January 1961. So fast forwarding a little more than 6 months into that, and we have these first tests of defoliants in South Vietnam occurring. It was in November of 61 that the new president officially approved the use of herbicides and the defoliation program, which began in January 1962, designated Operation Ranch Hand. And by the time it ended 9 years later, some 18 million gallons of chemicals would be sprayed on an estimated 20% of South Vietnam's jungles and mangrove forests, as well as in areas of Cambodia and Laos. 18 million gallons. 80 million litres. That is a lot, to say the least. In the research for this episode, I realised that there was enough on this topic of chemical counterinsurgency to be its own episode or perhaps an entire podcast series in and of itself. But more than that, I realized that the various factors and decisions that led to its adoption said so much about the larger themes associated with America's deadly excursion into Vietnam that was developing rapidly as Kennedy took office. The story of how it came to pass that 18 million gallons of herbicides were sprayed from planes across Vietnam and Southeast Asia will do a lot to explain the position of both the US and South Vietnam in this fast approaching war. And it is where we will begin the first parts of this final installment in the path to the Second Indochina War, the kind of sojourn that we're on in the series at the moment. But I do not want to completely bury the lead, as it were. So first things first, Operation Ranch Hand, used a variety of herbicides. Agent Orange was a specific blend, and recognizable via the orange stripe on the 55-gallon drums it was stored in. There were other combinations too: Agent Blue, Agent Green, Agent Pink, White, Bromacil, Dalapon, Dinoxol, Trinoxol. Agent Orange will eventually be the most widely used of these, but it was still, essentially, a combination of those two active ingredients that were present in that first test in August 1961, 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T. But there was another dark passenger in the mix, a contaminant born of the manufacturing process: tetrachlorodibenzodioxin, TCDD, also known as simply dioxin. This is what is known as a persistent organic pollutant, not absorbed by most plants and not soluble in water. It can attach to fine soil particles and sediment, carry downstream, or settle in bodies of water. It does not degrade readily. It is the result of the deliberate, accelerated production of 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T, the chemicals mixed to create the majority of the herbicides used in Operation Ranch Hand. Dioxin was produced as the basis for the agents was manufactured at a higher temperature than recommended. So, not on purpose, but perhaps as a side effect of requiring, 18 million gallons of something. You might do it a bit quicker, cut a few corners. Those aware of Agent Orange today are no doubt aware of the effects that dioxin had. These effects are shocking, depressing, hard to confront. To put it bluntly, dioxin is an awful substance. It causes various types of illnesses, including cancer, cardiovascular disease, and type 2 diabetes. If that wasn't bad enough, it can also have epigenetic impacts. To quote one source here, Vietnamese researchers have been studying the impacts of Agent Orange since the war and have found an increased risk of abnormal birth outcomes, including infertility, miscarriages, stillbirths, and birth defects via both paternal and maternal exposure. Among the birth defects found were spina bifida, hydrocephaly, malformations of the extremities, musculature issues, developmental disabilities, congenital heart defects, and cleft palate. Vietnamese researchers have also found higher rates of birth defects in the grandchildren of the wartime exposed population. End quote. Estimates vary, but perhaps some 3 million Vietnamese would suffer health problems as a result of dioxin exposure. Additionally, perhaps another 2 million or so US military personnel and their offspring would also suffer from their proximity to its use or handling the chemicals. As one veteran put it, "I died in Vietnam, but I didn't even know it." Of the various shades of horror resulting from campaigns that I generally put under the banner of death from above, Operation Ranch Hand it's hard to put into words. It was a literal blight on the landscape, but one which salted the soil and water with a kind of plague, but was at the time thought of as a novel tool of counterinsurgency. If the guerrillas were the fish and the people were the sea, well then why not simply poison the ocean? Okay, welcome back, my dear listener. Very small introduction again, just reiterating the predominant focus in these episodes is on the US and South Vietnam, and we're hoping to fill in gaps around the circumstances that lead into the Second Indochina War. In part 1, we discussed the state building in both North and South Vietnam subsequent to the division born of the Geneva Accords in 1954. We've touched on the way in which the Eisenhower administration began entangling itself into the region and designating South Vietnam as its cork in the bottle against the perceived spread of communism in the region, as well as how President Diem of South Vietnam enacted a series of policies designed to crush political opponents, particularly the Southern Communists, and how this group made efforts to take up armed struggle against the regime. This would eventually result in the North coming to the decision to back an organization capable of taking power in the South, the National Liberation Front, or NLF, or Viet Cong. At the end of the last episode, we explored how this was done in practice, how civilians were implicated, and the realization by some Americans involved that things were not going that well. Eisenhower allowed for those US advisors in South Vietnam to take on a slightly more involved role prior to President Kennedy taking office at the start of 1961. If we could call all of that the beginnings of an entanglement, in this episode we will see how this became a frightening knot of commitments, interactions, and circumstances that will serve as the final steps on that path to the Second Indochina War. As I mentioned in the opening there, I found in researching this episode that tracing the origins and implementation of Operation Ranch Hand and acknowledging the eventual horror and disaster that the defoliants and herbicides cause, well, I found that to be a rather handy sort of candle to light this episode with. Explaining it highlights the international factors at play, the strains in the relationship between the US and the Diem regime, the goals of containment at any cost, as well as the presidency of Kennedy and the demise of Diem. You'll notice equivocating on whether it's the right thing to do, both wanting to win at any price, but not wanting to win at any price. The positioning of the South Vietnamese regime as not simply puppets waiting to be told what to do, all in the hope that it will be the right course of action and will not end badly. But the unforeseen consequences will be extremely dire, affect millions of innocent people, hurt the reputation of the US, and be felt for generations. So, almost on all of those points, it's a microcosm. It's a handy parallel for us to explore this part of the story with. Before I explain all of that and more, I want to take a moment to thank everyone who is supporting the show via Patreon or has made a one-time donation via PayPal. Incredibly proud to receive that as recognition for the work that goes into the podcast, and I want to thank everyone who has left reviews, comments, or ratings as well. You are all awesome. One last thing, I also realize we've spent 3 episodes now away from the main story. We will speak about Pol Pot in this episode, so look out. But generally speaking, going forward, this isn't going to become a Vietnam War podcast. Important events as they pertain to the Khmer Rouge and Cambodia and the eventual civil war there will definitely get some detail, as will the major events of the Vietnam War generally, but focus will return to Cambodia predominantly. It's just, that historical hurricane, right? Okay, so let's explore the 6 months or so between Kennedy's inauguration and those first tests of herbicide in August 1961 to set the scene here. Okay, so let's start at the start with Kennedy. He's voted into office, he's very young. It's also important perhaps to note that it was a very close election between he and Nixon in terms of the national popular vote. Something like 0.2% in it. His election also represented the Democratic Party coming in after Eisenhower's Republican administration. Keep that in mind as an underlying theme. Will be a sort of reluctance to look soft in comparison to the Republicans in a variety of scenarios. Anyway, an important aspect of Kennedy coming to office in terms of how it relates to our story actually occurs the day before his inauguration. As is usually the case when an administration changes hands like this, there is a kind of final briefing, handing over the baton, so to speak. Here's where the stuff is, this is what we are up to, the coffee goes in this shelf there, and we are secretly planning an invasion over here. In this case, and considering what we know is coming down the line, it might seem odd that Vietnam was barely mentioned. In fact, it was Laos that Eisenhower insisted would be the critical domino at that point in time. Laos was in the midst of something of a crisis, and I will touch on that more in a second, but in regards to Vietnam, a member of the Kennedy team later recalled that basically it was just a given, this unquestioned assumption really, that Vietnam was not to fall to Ho Chi Minh, that the Saigon regime must be supported. For a new administration with, let's face it, a lot to do, some questions about what to do here or there were just put in the basket of, stay the course. It was the sensible thing to do to just keep doing what the last people were doing. Maybe later, when we've got some time, we can have another look. Especially for something that was explained as a kind of not that important right now, bigger fish to fry kind of thing. Another important factor which would influence the early atmosphere Kennedy was walking into happened 2 weeks before his inauguration. Khrushchev had made a public declaration on the 6th of January 1961, stating that the Soviets would support wars of national liberation, which basically changed the game slightly in terms of the wars that had characterized the Cold War up until this point. These were conflicts where subversion of national governments, principally through guerrilla actions, would be the primary tactic. This was far from the grand nuclear exchanges that had occupied Washington, nor the kinds of limited but still conventional wars that had been fought in, say, Korea. This was a different beast. In response to this, what is known as the Khrushchev Doctrine, it was deemed necessary to have the capabilities to fight these new conflicts and to identify areas in which it would need to be utilized. Along with this came the idea to help train local forces in the fighting itself. Eventually, the challenge posed by the situation in Vietnam would be this kind of centerpiece of that in action, and built upon by the previous administration's moves to solidify that relationship with South Vietnam, which we covered in the previous episode. If we are attempting to explain the ways in which this all developed, a lot of it stems from inheritance from administration to administration, and what was going on domestically and internationally, which will influence the decisions of those in charge. As I've alluded to, one of the big things Kennedy has to face almost immediately is the crisis in Laos. Now, I realize we've been rather light on the Laotian front for, this entire series, and I apologize, but that trend is set to continue. All we really need to know is that following the Geneva Accords, Laos, like Cambodia, was supposed to be, and stay, neutral. But a struggle for power between supporters of the US and those more associated with the Viet Minh, as well as a neutral middle ground, erupted into a civil war. Appeals were made to the Soviets for support, who began airlifting supplies to the Pathet Lao, the communist and nationalist movement that were more or less the Laotian equivalent of the Viet Minh or the Khmer Issarak and later the Khmer Rouge, and, associated with them in the sense that they were more or less answering to the Vietnamese Politburo. Interestingly, there are more than a few parallels with the Cambodian case here, like the North Vietnamese using parts of Laos as encampments and as part of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and, of course, supporting the Pathet Lao militarily and with essentially an ideology. There was also the role of a royal or two in politics, notably the supposedly neutral Prince Suvarnabhuma, who eventually sides with the communists and goes against a right-wing US-supporting government. But to wrap it up slightly, the civil war in Laos at this time is pulling quite a bit of focus for the new president, and we've got the Soviets and the United States in yet another proxy war. In March, as fighting continued between the contending forces in Laos, we also get a little hint at what is a prominent theme for US administrations and their excursions in Southeast Asia. As the fighting developed, and attempts to gain as much territory as the other, with the view of some kind of peaceful settlement on the horizon became the goal, Kennedy will say that, quote, "We cannot and will not accept any visible humiliation," end quote. Laos gets very serious at a couple of junctures, and it really is the precursor to a lot of things that will characterize decision-making in Vietnam as well. If you sat down and said, well, what are we going to do here? And Kennedy was very fond of these kinds of committee meetings with advisors and coming to decisions that way. Well, the people around inevitably brought up some possibilities. If you're saying you are committed to stopping communism spreading, to not being humiliated along the way, then the options are, well, let's put troops in. Yes, but what if then China, the Soviets and the North Vietnamese put more troops in to support the Pathet Lao? Well, we could put even more troops up against them, and I guess then we would need to strike North Vietnam, and I guess then maybe you would have to strike China. You'll then maybe get someone else in the meeting saying, well, should we do that? Are we just going to have to fight these people in 5 or 10 years anyway? Maybe we should just go straight to nuclear weapons, right? Which is getting pretty serious. Okay, well, let's walk that back a little bit, but still intervene. How many people can we send to fight a war before it's a war? That's a quandary for sure. And perhaps luckily, in the Laotian instance, a ceasefire is called by the Pathet Lao in early May 61, and moves for a diplomatic solution are put on the table. The crisis was over, for now, and perhaps the decision about whether to go in hard, and the consequences that would have, were decided by events in Laos as opposed to in the White House itself. So that's, one background item out of 3 or 4. We've got the Khrushchev doctrine to contend with, planning to basically go along with what Eisenhower was doing in Laos and Vietnam, and then a little mishap called the Bay of Pigs invasion occurs in April, just 4 months into the presidency. Now, this had been planned by Eisenhower, but Kennedy in the end had given it the green light. It was a huge failure, huge embarrassment, foreshadows one of the most frightening events in history a year later with the Cuban Missile Crisis. You've also got the friction coming out of East and West Germany as the Berlin Wall begins construction in June of 1961. All of these kind of come together in a way that, well, to put it simply, the Kennedy administration had taken a couple of, at least perceived, losses, and was looking for a win. Where would that win be? Where would the line be drawn in the sand? Well, South Vietnam presented a fairly viable case. All the reports coming out of there, the last one having been made just a couple of months before Kennedy took office, we actually mentioned it at the last bit of the last episode, it was by Lansdale, who said that the next year is going to be crucial for South Vietnam. And while Laos turned out to be, well, just not an appropriate place to jump in to the tackle, South Vietnam had some relative benefits. It was more unified, it had a larger and better trained army, it had access to the sea and allowed for naval and air force contributions more readily. It also had the benefit of there being a buffer between South Vietnam, North Vietnam, and China. So any actions there in the south would not be directly at the doorstep of that southern part of China and invite the kind of retaliation from a big power that you want to avoid. So there are 3 main questions that Kennedy has to contend with. Whether to make a full and unreserved commitment to preventing a communist victory, whether to commit ground troops to achieve that, and whether to give top priority to the military defeat of the Viet Cong, or to forcing the Diem Regime to adopt political reforms necessary to gain important popular support. His time will be cut short, as we all know, but the 34 months that Kennedy is president will be crucial. And on all of those questions, the direction will be toward escalation and further US commitment, But on basically all of those points, it could be said that there were only half measures enacted. Kennedy's initial moves in Vietnam with his new administration comprised of mostly younger advisors, perhaps most importantly his Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara. All these initial moves were basically around coming to grips with this new kind of warfare, these wars of national liberation, which were seen as an extension of the domino theory generally, and, naturally, with the attendant need for the containment of communism. But they would need to develop new ways of fighting these wars. In essence, counterinsurgency will be the word of the day. Just a day after the Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba collapsed spectacularly, Kennedy requested from his Defense Department a comprehensive program covering military, social, and political actions necessary to prevent a communist takeover in Vietnam. That's where we were going to have our win. You get the sense when researching this period of history that Kennedy, like many presidents, loved getting a good report from the area. He wanted input and advice from those he trusted. In this instance, there are a few that come back to him basically saying, look, the situation is that if we are going to avoid humiliation, and this is the place we're going to do it, then we need to drastically bolster the South Vietnamese military, as well as get a lot more of our boys in there too. Early doors, Kennedy will secretly order 400 more US Special Forces troops and 100 more military advisors to South Vietnam. Now, I say secretly, as these increases were not made publicly, and the reason is that the Geneva Accords were still, they're hanging by a thread really, but even though the US had not signed them, they had pledged not to undermine them either. So going over the 685 men limit on the size of the US military mission in Saigon would be in breach of that. And once you breach it, well, to hell with it, right? Another breach would be to sign an official military partnership with South Vietnam. Up until then, the US had been acting only in an advisory manner. Now these are all signals of properly abandoning any pretense of peace that the end of the war with the French had brought to the region. But to be fair, and as a report by Kennedy's advisors communicated, well, the US is now retaliating on the source of guerrilla aggression in the South, which is coming from Hanoi. Basically, it's a they started it argument. And hey, that is, technically, that could be up for debate. Either way, Kennedy allows not only for this increase in advisors and special forces, but also gets this partnership signed by Diem, as well as instructing the CIA and special forces to start clandestine missions of sabotage in the north. On top of that, agreements to fund and train an increase of 30,000 troops in the South Vietnamese army are made. Now, it should be noted that all of this is occurring within a somewhat contradictory back and forth of advice to Kennedy. Some reports are coming in saying we should just go all in and hard right now. Others are pointing out that there is the issue of Diem. Up until now, he had not really delivered on the promises to enact the kinds of reforms necessary to warrant us going in to support him in such an overt way. There is, in almost equal measure, reluctance and eagerness. Kennedy will famously say, in regard to his unenthusiastic attitude to putting so-called proper troops on the ground, that, quote, they want a force of American troops. They say it's necessary in order to restore confidence and maintain morale. But it will be just like Berlin. The troops will march in, the bands will play, the crowds will cheer, and in 4 days, everyone will have forgotten. Then we will be told we have to send more troops. It's like taking a drink. The effect wears off, and you have to take another. End quote. Reminds me of another similarly appropriate phrase about problematic drinking that we could use here, where 1 drink is too many, and 10 drinks is not enough. And yet, by the end of his presidency, while he will have abstained from putting proper troops on the ground, he will have increased the military advisor presence by a lot, from around 600 to 16,000. But Kennedy was still aware of history. As we alluded to in the last episode, there is this kind of disconnect between what happened and what was being considered what was being said behind the scenes. Kennedy will also say in this time that this war could be won only so long as it remained Vietnam's war. Otherwise, the Americans would lose like the French. But, alas, the Kennedy administration believed in itself and America, and even though they had acknowledged the problems that Diem posed, they felt that his regime, his army, even the people of South Vietnam, could be cured of their deficiencies if enough dedicated Americans, civilians, and military became involved in South Vietnam and, well, showed them how to get on, how to win the war. An analogy I couldn't quite get out of my head while I was writing this kind of reminded me of when I was a kid playing Nintendo. I had an older brother by a few years and he would play the same games, but he was just kind of better at them than I was. Oftentimes there can be a frustration in watching someone do something ineptly that you know you could do in a second if it was in your hands. You know, it might have been a hard boss character or a tough opponent in a soccer video game. And I would try and then just say, "Hey, can you do this for me?" And he would have the confidence and skill to do it with ease, then hand the controller back. It was still my game, but it was being played by someone else. I just feel there is something similar here where the US and particularly those in the military are just thinking, look, if we could just get our hands in there, it will still be your war, don't worry, but if we can just kind of do it for you, that would be better and easier, and then you can still win. Then we win, freedom wins. Amongst these discussions about definitely committing, but in exactly what way, we can bring the conversation back to the development of what will eventually become Operation Ranch Hand and the defoliation program that will cause so much destruction and misery, and hopefully give us a kind of path into the final years of both Diem and Kennedy's time in the story. What I noticed in my research is that the leaning into methods such as Agent Orange to combat the Viet Cong was kind of originally intended as a means of avoiding the full-scale intervention that some in the military were looking for. They wanted something substantial straight away. No more committees, no more lengthy reports and discussions, just go in and get it done with whatever means necessary. Someone like the, let's say, mildly hawkish Air Force General Curtis LeMay was definitely of that opinion, saying that, quote, "Going to war is a very serious business, and once you make that decision that you're going to do that, then you ought to be prepared to do just that," end quote. Later, he will advocate for bombing North Vietnam back to the Stone Age. Others are saying that if you got, around 200,000 troops in there right now, tops, that would be all you need to protect South Vietnam, mop up the Viet Cong, and even ward off any potential counters from North Vietnam and even China. But Kennedy didn't want to do that. Instead, more advisors, more aid, more prodding of Diem to clean up his act would be the way forward. A prudent approach. Some in the military thought a little too prudent. But this prudence carried with it the possibility of other means of effective counterinsurgency. Way back in April of 61, before the Bay of Pigs, before some of the other commitments were made that would signify this intent for the US to make South Vietnam the line in the sand, a memo was sent by Walt Rostow, a foreign affairs advisor to Kennedy, which had a couple of updates and recommendations about Vietnam. The underlying message of the memo was one of greater participation in the South and combating the growing Viet Cong insurgency. In it, 9 courses of action were recommended, one of which was that a military hardware research team head to Vietnam to work on the use of various, quote, techniques and gadgets that were in development and could possibly be utilized in the conflict. Aerial defoliation would become one of these unspecified techniques and gadgets. This soon turned into an accepted proposal to, quote, assist the government of Vietnam to develop, with the help of modern technology, new techniques for use against Viet Cong forces. Kennedy signed off on this in late April. By mid-May, These proposals were offered to Diem, which he too accepted. Not long afterwards, a group of experts were on the case to carry out this particular mission. Around 2 months later in July, this team had begun devising exactly what kind of new techniques and gadgets they would propose. And one team in particular had come up with a novel solution to the problem of effectively controlling South Vietnam's borders against unfriendly elements. And I'm paraphrasing and quoting a book published by the US Air Force about herbicide use in Southeast Asia. It came out in around 1982, and interestingly, it is quite matter-of-fact about a lot of these developments, as you would expect. But anyway, in it, they say that the aim was essentially to use plant-killing herbicides as a means of stripping away foliage that concealed enemy activities, and could even potentially be used to destroy crops as a means of denying food to the enemy. In the first instance, you could imagine, say, a convoy heading down a river or road. If that path is surrounded by jungle or cover on either immediate side, well, it makes it much easier for the enemy to ambush you. If you push that back, almost creating a kind of firebreak on either side, you are limiting the chances of a successful ambush. Likewise, you can imagine the kind of help that might provide in identifying something like the Ho Chi Minh Trail. By July 10th, the first batch of defoliation chemicals, as we said, a combination of herbicides that was likely to contain the toxic dioxin pollutant, was shipped to Saigon to begin testing. 1 month later, those initial tests north of Saigon that I introduced the episode with were conducted. Again, on an area that Diem himself had chosen. As I explained, the initial test sprays were conducted by a mix of American and South Vietnamese pilots who had been trained by US Air Force personnel. And while the Americans weren't immediately impressed by the results, Diem certainly was. Within a few weeks, the South Vietnamese president was discussing the use of herbicides with a different type of target in mind, potentially to destroy crops being grown by the Viet Cong before they could be harvested. In this meeting with an American delegation, he outlined his worries about these crops, and then inquired about a kind of powder that he had heard the US had, which could do this, but that its use would require President Kennedy's authorization or something like that. Apparently the delegation were a little confused by this request and said that what Diem was asking for was probably more in the realms of chemical and biological weapons, outside the realm of international law. But they did have this herbicide, which could be what he was thinking of. Apparently he said that he didn't care what it was, as long as it denied the Viet Cong access to these crops. Toward the final months of 1961, the situation around South Vietnam was noticeably getting worse. For instance, it was being calculated that Saigon had control of less than half of the countryside generally, and in places around the Mekong Delta, almost the entire region was in the hands of the Viet Cong. In September, Phuoc Thanh, a provincial capital around 50 miles from Saigon, was captured by the insurgency, controlled for several hours, and the province chief was publicly beheaded. They left before Diem's troops arrived. Another round of decision-making by the Americans was necessary. This was around the time when Kennedy was being urged to commit thousands of troops. The defoliation spray campaign was one idea that came out of this that could be done immediately, regardless of the decision to commit troops or not. But there was a sense of, wanting to keep this rather low-key. It was recommended that the defoliation could be carried out by aircraft carrying South Vietnamese markings, that the pilots could be even wearing civilian clothes. A slight addendum to that plan was that it could be done using hired commercial planes and flown by disguised CIA pilots. On this, like the decision to commit troops, Kennedy didn't make a decision right away, although that didn't stop research in the background about how a defoliation campaign might be undertaken, or indeed what the possible ramifications of it might be. A special task force promptly came up with a few proposals about how to best address the growing problem of the Viet Cong in areas of the South. Early goals included stripping the Cambodian, Laotian, North Vietnamese border of foliage to remove the vegetation, giving them cover. This turned into a 3-phase program which would target crops first, then hundreds of miles of jungle, then the border areas. On the 3rd of November 1961, McNamara receives a recommendation from one of the Joint Chiefs of Staff that these operations should all be undertaken in cooperation with attacks on Viet Cong personnel, and interestingly, points out that the defoliation program needs to be handled very sensitively. Quote, "Care must be taken to assure that the United States does not become the target for charges of employing chemical or biological warfare. International repercussions against the United States could be most serious. In this connection, it is recommended that the operations be covered concurrently with a publicity campaign, as outlined by Task Force Vietnam in Saigon." End quote. Now, as I said earlier, I'm getting a lot of the details of the history here from the US Air Force's own history of these events. I rarely consult military sources, but these are really fascinating from not only the huge amounts of detail they do give, but also the barely disguised perspective of the US Air Force. It's not an especially compassionate source, but it is very matter-of-fact. It goes on to describe McNamara's reaction to the recommendation. He too shares the concern for how this campaign might look to the outside world. And I'll quote again here from, it's written by William Buckingham. It's called The Air Force and Herbicides in Southeast Asia. Quote, "He, McNamara, too was concerned about the possibility of an adverse propaganda impact, but he did not limit his concern to the food denial phase. He states that the American embassy in Saigon had been asked to comment on the possibility of persuading President Diem to assume responsibility for the proposed program and to issue an explicit public statement which would include the assertion, believed at the time, that the spray would not be harmful to livestock and humans." End quote. So I added a little bit of emphasis on what I think is a key line there. Believed at the time. Because it's worth sort of thinking about that. This book was published in 82, and at the time there had been a steadily growing voice of mainly Vietnam veterans who were saying that they were suffering adverse health effects. This book, about 260 pages or so, spends about 2 pages at the very, very end saying that some studies are going on that are looking into this, but that there's no proof at the moment. It acknowledges the possibility, but that's all, which makes sense given who is writing. But if we take that a little further, we now know that Agent Orange is going to be awful. I mean, it's almost like a nuclear reactor meltdown accident kind of environmental and human health effect on that level of proportion. I mean, literally, like if you compare how many people died at Chernobyl and even the worst estimates of the associated deaths, Agent Orange is worse. So how do we rate that kind of thinking about, well, it was believed at the time to not have any harm to humans? I mean, if we try and put ourselves back then, it was, as late as the 1950s when advertising showing doctors recommending a particular brand of cigarettes was only beginning to be walked back. Were the manufacturers of these herbicides to know just how much dioxin was contaminating the chemicals? Is saying we weren't to know enough, considering the damage? I don't really think so. And I think the tentativeness of the Kennedy administration in going ahead with the defoliation program points to the fact that from its earliest formulation, there was an understanding that it wasn't quite morally sound, even without knowing what the worst possible effects could be. And, on that point, if you are going to spray 80 million litres of something on a few countries from planes, perhaps this is a scenario where you make absolutely sure that it isn't going to harm those spraying it or those it is being sprayed on for generations. But they went along anyway. They assessed the situation, and they felt it was the most prudent thing to do. This echoes how we spoke about the entire Vietnam paradox in the last episode. They kind of knew it wasn't the greatest idea, but the path of least resistance wasn't putting 200,000 troops on the ground yet. No, at this time, the quickest and least problematic solution was simply spraying the landscape from a low altitude with chemicals that strip trees and plants of their leaves in a matter of days. One member of the Kennedy administration summed up the pros and cons, and I'll quote that same text again here. Quote, "On the plus side, he noted that US diplomatic and military representatives in South Vietnam had recommended approval without reservation. In addition, preliminary tests were favorable, and approval would comply with President Diem's wishes. The negative aspects included the distinct possibility that the North Vietnamese would exploit propaganda aspects of a defoliation program by making charges of chemical or biological warfare. In conclusion, Bundy, who was acting Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, Bundy stated that from the military standpoint, the program should be approved. However, in light of the political and psychological warfare risks involved, he recommended that President Kennedy be asked to give the final clearance." End quote. Again, no mention in the cons there about the possibility that it, completely ruins the landscape and kills lots of people for many years. Anyway, this was taken up the chain to Kennedy. He was given assurances that any approved program would be well targeted and executed with precision. On some of the less favourable aspects, it was explained that the use of defoliants does not technically violate any rule of international law concerning chemical warfare and is an accepted tactic of war, and that this chemical counterinsurgency tool could be of substantial assistance in defeating the Viet Cong. Kennedy accepted the advice and committed the United States to Operation Ranch Hand, with extensive defoliation and crop destruction in Southeast Asia to begin in early 1962. I think the best way to think about it is in terms of, what levers does the US administration have to pull here? They've decided against a full re-evaluation of the situation. They're sticking with Diem. They're sticking in South Vietnam, for now. They are against putting in hundreds of thousands of troops. They're going along with the idea that a military solution is currently more viable than a politically based one. So they resort to what they can do from above with what they are good at. Death from above, basically. It's the easiest solution. And it is one that they will employ in Cambodia in the not-too-distant future as well. But while I've been focusing primarily on the US decision-making process here, let us not forget the role of Diem as well. As we've seen, he hasn't been sitting idly by letting the Air Force come up with this scheme and pushing it on him. No, he's been setting areas to test. He's been impressed with the results. He has been the one asking them to come and destroy Viet Cong crops, and signed off on any proposals about further expanding the scope of the program. And to just reinforce the point that he isn't just a puppet of the US, but there was this you need me and I need you kind of dynamic that we discussed in the last episode. Well, toward the end of 1961, the US will propose a new limited partnership deal with the Diem Regime in exchange for increased military assistance, a possible security treaty, potential troop deployments. The US administration wanted Diem to engage more with the political, economic, and military reforms that they felt South Vietnam desperately needed. And he refused. He accepted more military aid, but rejected further administration via the US as an attempt, just like the French, to act as a colonizer. As Christopher Gaucher writes in his History of Vietnam, quote, "Shocked to be treated at the same level as the French colonists, the Americans backed down. But Diem's Gaullism," which is a reference to French General and President Charles de Gaulle, which sort of means very independent and nationalistic, Diem's Gaullism had the Americans livid in the cables they fired back to Washington. How could they save Vietnam if its president would not let them? The two sides now talked past each other more than ever before, each righteously convinced of the validity of its own position. The Americans failed to grasp how their increasingly intrusive efforts to contain communism could translate into a threat to the national sovereignty of their junior partner. End quote. As the Pentagon Papers note, which maybe I need to explain, they're sort of like a compilation of McNamara's own request for an internal history of the US in Vietnam. It was requested in 1967. It was later scandalously leaked and published in 1971. Basically, These papers say that at this time the US softened slightly on their demands of Diem, instead settling on a close partnership, which meant frequent consultation with the South Vietnamese government rather than insisting, as they had attempted at the end of 1961, on taking part in the decision-making itself. The Pentagon study explains this time period by saying that the overall effect of these actions was to give the military side of the war higher priority than the political, and that, quote, continuing to support Diem without reform meant quite simply that he, and not we, would determine the course of the country's counter-insurgent effort, and that the steps he took to assure his continuance in power would continue to take priority over all else. End quote. The papers, remember this is an internally sourced history, also lament that this was the way it went, considering how things ended for Diem in 1963. But as 1962 gets going, with the US and South Vietnam in a rather odd situation, like two people ballroom dancing but keeping an awkward distance between their hips, so too does Operation Ranch Hand begin. It's worth pointing out, again, that, there are seemingly more important things to occupy the Kennedy administration still. Laos is still shaky, Berlin is still shaky, and even just the decision to send troops or not to Vietnam was a bigger priority in their mind than what seemed like the somewhat trivial decision to spray some bits of jungle and a few enemy crops. Ranch Hand went on, and US pilots were chosen to fly the missions. In a fairly big nod to the somewhat low-key operation this was supposed to be, the original pilots chosen were told that they were just going to Southeast Asia for 120 days. It was very much a need-to-know basis kind of thing. These pilots were instructed to tell their families even less, that they were just going on an extended, temporary duty, and that they couldn't reveal the location. They were instructed not to write letters home for the time being, and the initial pool of potential pilots were even told that they would be flying in civilian clothing, fly aircraft without US Air Force markings, and would not be acknowledged as US military if they were captured. Even though Kennedy had approved an overt, as opposed to covert, defoliation campaign, McNamara still thought it was prudent to go about this early phase as if it was basically all being done by the South Vietnamese. Even the chemicals themselves had to be kind of smuggled in to an extent. They were marked as civilian cargo, so they would not be inspected by the International Control Commission, which was sort of like a vestige still in place after Geneva. Some in the upper echelons of the administration began to wonder if doing it in this disguised manner would have a greater blowback if they were found out, and eventually it was decided to be more upfront about the whole thing. They weren't going to disguise it so much. The administration reckoned that if any questions about the Geneva Accords being violated came up, they would respond with this statement. The United States has acceded, which means agreed, to the government of Vietnam's request for expanded aid in men and material and is determined to help preserve its independence. This is the sole objective of the United States. The United States will terminate these measures as soon as North Vietnam ends its acts of aggression. End quote. So basically the thing we said before. They're relying on a they started it, we are just responding in kind sort of messaging. There were, according to these sources, some issues with getting the required chemicals in time to start. One of them saying that the acquisition of defoliants occurred on an expedited basis, which again I can only presume might be connected to the higher temperatures used and the higher levels of dioxin contaminating the herbicides in order to make them as quickly as the government needed. On January 10th, an announcement was made by the South Vietnamese government about the upcoming program. It said that US assistance had been sought by the Republic of Vietnam in clearing certain key areas of thick vegetation, that the weed-killing chemicals were commercially used in North America, Europe, Africa, and the Soviet Union, that the chemical will be supplied by the US. Again, at the request of the Vietnamese government, also that it was non-toxic, will not harm wildlife, domestic animals, human beings, or the soil. That same day, tests were conducted using a different plane, at C-123s, and a new spraying system. And Agent Purple was in fact dispersed on one of these earliest flights. The defoliation program properly began on the 13th, from an altitude of 150 feet and at about 150 miles per hour. Interestingly, these flights were all mandated to have a Vietnamese aircraft commander on board, even though all of the flying and spraying was done by US Air Force pilots. This was done to basically have a representative on board so that in the event of any criticism, they could be trotted out, pointed to, and you could say, no, look, they're doing it, not us. This aircraft commander had no actual authority on the mission. And even though they were supposed to be a rated pilot, one captain actually coaxed one of these South Vietnamese into the cockpit at one point so he could see how the controls for the C-123s felt. It was after about a second that the captain realized this aircraft commander was not a pilot at all. He was a navigator. And the South Vietnamese had been sending them only to fulfill the requirement that they be on board. Apparently, this later became a situation where they wouldn't even send a navigator, just anyone who happened to be available. On the 2nd of Feb, not even a month after Ranch Hand began, an aircraft was lost, representing the first US Air Force casualties in the war. Bizarrely, no evidence of sabotage, engine failure, or hits from fire were found on the wreckage, although the downed plane had been scoured by Viet Cong. The cause of the crash was never officially known. Almost immediately, the North Vietnamese, Viet Cong, Soviets, and even the People's Republic of China seized on the propaganda opportunity, saying that a chemical warfare campaign was underway, spraying toxic chemicals on crops and natural resources. Local South Vietnamese that complained their crops had been ruined could apply for damage claims to the tune of about $6,000, which would be around $50,000 today. Meanwhile, the effectiveness of some of the defoliants on different kinds of vegetation was still being figured out. Sometimes it wouldn't work as well as intended, and the decision was simply made to drop napalm on the same areas afterwards. Some analysts wondered if the operation was having anything but the most marginal gains militarily. There was a general view that it wasn't worth it, that the planes could be used elsewhere, and that the similarities with gas warfare were not good. In the middle of 1962, Secretary of State Dean Rusk wrote to Kennedy voicing the wider concern here. Quote, "The way to win a guerrilla war, basically, is to win the people. Crop destruction runs counter to this basic rule. The problem of identifying fields on which the Viet Cong depend is hardly susceptible to solution so long as the Viet Cong and the people are co-mingled. The government will gain the enmity of people whose crops are destroyed and whose wives and children will either have to stay in place and suffer hunger or become homeless refugees living on the uncertain bounty of a not too efficient government." End quote. Roger Hilsman, the Secretary of State for East Asian Affairs, had a similar sentiment. Quote, "The Chinese communists won against a technologically superior enemy, as did the Viet Minh when fighting the French. In both instances, the communists turned the technological superiority of the enemy to their own advantage by convincing the populace on the ground that the enemy represented foreign imperialist barbarism." End quote. A congressman from Wisconsin was disturbed by an article he had read about Operation Ranch Hand, and he wrote a letter to Kennedy as well that I think encapsulates what we now think with hindsight about all of this. He started by recounting how at the height of World War II, Roosevelt had declared that the US would never use chemical weapons unless they were first used by an enemy, how the US had not used chemicals to destroy the rice crop in Japan, even in the face of fanatical resistance, that it would violate Christian ethics and known laws of war, that the tactics of the Viet Cong and now the US and South Vietnam were creating a horrible dilemma for the common Vietnamese citizen, concerned with saving theirs and their families' lives. He also questioned whether the survival of the Diem regime was worth compromising America's moral principles. These concerns were countered, relying on that, technicality we mentioned earlier, that it wasn't chemical warfare, the moral question was therefore not an issue. Since it was chemicals that were used elsewhere for agriculture, it cannot be said that it was breaking international law, that the chemicals weren't harmful, so they're not poison, that the South Vietnamese had requisitioned this and were spraying the herbicides, just with US assistance. Aside from bending the truth quite a bit there, the rebuttal ended by bemoaning the fact that the congressman had unfortunately fallen for the distorted facts spread by communist propaganda and the press. Despite the consternation about Operation Ranch Hand from some quarters, McNamara kept at it, instead requisitioning a scientific research team to figure out how to make it better. It turned out some results. They figured that the plants and trees were best affected when they were still growing, rather than dormant, and that there needed to be a heavier dose of herbicides. Diem was apparently still eager, particularly to start using it on Viet Cong crops. Changes to how the flight sprayed the defoliants apparently yielded better results too. Spraying missions in October apparently increased ground visibility for the Air Force by more than 7 times. The attitude generally changed, and more approvals were given to spray thousands of acres of jungle. As we said at the outset, this would eventually cover more than 20% of Vietnam's jungles and mangrove areas on rivers, as well as parts of Cambodia and Laos. I'll wrap up our discussion of defoliation by quoting Buckingham's US Air Force History of Herbicides in Southeast Asia. Quote, "The controversies and continuing questions surrounding ranch hand and herbicides in Southeast Asia did not end when American combat involvement in the war ceased. There was the problem of the 2.2 million gallons of Agent Orange in deteriorating steel drums which had to be used or destroyed. Finally, the ecological consequences and long-range health effects of the herbicide program had to be assessed, a process which still continues." End quote. So as previously mentioned, that was written in 1982, and those consequences would turn out to be very, very bad for everyone affected. If we consider the congressman's letter once again, particularly the mention of the horrible dilemma faced by your average Vietnamese citizen, the way that the US was deciding to wade into this conflict becomes difficult to understand. We've said this throughout the last few episodes, and that's why I thought focusing on the defoliation and herbicides in 1961 and 1962, like the decision-making to get there, was helpful in giving us that broader picture of why and how. It seems at every junction there are people questioning which is the best course of action, yet the direction of movement always stays the same. It's like a group of people getting on an escalator and the entire time discussing amongst themselves if they should be walking up with the stairs at the same time or not, and before long they are at the top anyway. And the question of compromising morality to save the Diem regime too, well, that is going to become all the more apparent in 1963. What we are going to see is just something like the tide changing here, an accumulation of dysfunctional policies, ignoring of the problems faced by large segments of the population, glaring instances of these kinds of nepotism and corruption which have plagued the regime from the start, and real backlash against the regime, even from some of the places in which they had felt would prop them up. A great example of this is the strategic hamlets that we discussed a little in the last episode. By September of 1962, the Ngo brothers had incorporated over 4 million people into a little over 3,000 hamlets. Almost a year later, those numbers doubled. That is an administrative nightmare for a government which until that point had tried to shrink the amount of those with genuine power into basically one family and its closest supporters. They could no longer count on those lower rungs of the bureaucracy to help in this massive project of social engineering, and the sheer amount of manpower needed to actually build these hamlets in the first place had further squeezed the juice out of a population who were already demanding better conditions from their government. All of that, ignoring the visceral pain that so many of these rural residents felt at being forcibly removed from their ancestral homes and farms for the stated purpose of keeping them from being exposed to a supposedly much worse national movement. Just take a moment to consider the situation these people are being forced into. Let's say it was a farmer who accidentally had his crop sprayed with and we'll use the language of the time, supposedly non-toxic herbicide. It kills your crop, you try and seek compensation, but your pleas go unheard. You and your family are surviving on basically nothing when you receive news that the government is now forcibly relocating you to a fenced-off, hastily built enclosure a few miles away. when you get there, the promised amenities and care are absent. Instead, you are now surrounded by barbed wire, trenches, and cement fortifications. We've talked about, political energy a few times in this series so far, and it's pretty easy to see how a few well-placed pieces of NLF propaganda might go a very long way in convincing that person to decide to support their movement. As Christopher Gosha writes, quote, "Distraught, Americans watched from the sidelines as Diem seemed to drive the peasantry straight into communist hands. Once again, they bemoaned the president's mad ideas about social revolution, village democracy, nation building, and personalism. They also knew that for No Din Diem, the Strategic Hamlets project served both to fight the communists and to protect the Republic's sovereignty from American efforts to run the show." Washington's frustration also grew as the American-trained and modernized Army of the Republic of Vietnam seemed incapable or unwilling to take the battle to the insurgents. Advisors were shocked when, in early 1963, 2,000 heavily armed, air-supported and motorized ARVN troops failed to smash the 300 to 400 Liberation Army forces holding the strategic hamlet of Ap Bac in Mai To province. The botched operation sent the American advisor who prepared the battle plan, Colonel John Paul Varn, into a fit of anger symbolic of the wider American frustration with their junior partner. End quote. Gosha goes on to say that those in the South Vietnamese army could and often did fight bravely, but the colonel saying, that was a miserable performance, it always is, these people make the same mistakes over and over again, is indicative of a real frustration with how this was all going. What I think we could safely characterize as a growing tension on behalf of the South Vietnamese people, many of those in the South Vietnamese government, army, Diem as well, not getting the results he wants, as well as this growing strain between this tense relationship between his regime and the necessary benefactor in the shape of the United States. It was like the dry summer season on a forest, waiting for a spark to begin a devastating bushfire. Do they call them bushfires overseas? In Australia, we say like bushfire season. Anyway, that spark was coming, quite literally in fact, in the shape of a Buddhist monk named Quang Duc, the man we began this mini-series with. But that was just the most visible explosion of the so-called Buddhist crisis. And as I said back in the first part of this, I would eventually need to go into some detail about exactly what had led someone to commit suicide in such a horrific fashion, as well as how it went on for months, and its impact was far-reaching. So, we enter the fabled year of 1963, the year that had so much in, I've had to spend 3 or 4 episodes trying to separate and contextualize the story because there was so much to get to. As I just said, this is the year where if you were on the ground in South Vietnam, it's almost true to say that what we might commonly refer to as the Vietnam War was already on. The Viet Cong control vast amounts of the South. Kennedy has instigated what we could probably generalize as a secret war to try and combat this insurgency, but has also given the green light to covert operations in the North. There really isn't that high of a threshold to say something is an active war. And if we look at what is going on generally, then it's hard to argue that the Second Indochina War hasn't already begun. Although I would personally say that the proper, out in the open Vietnam War, from the American perspective, begins in 1964. So I'm still calling these episodes the path to the Second Indochina War, even though I think that's up for debate. Either way, walking in the metaphorical forest of South Vietnam in 1963, you are seeing a lot of worrying, extremely flammable material everywhere you go. This is when it turns from simply fighting a communist insurgency to a full-blown collapse of government and widespread anger, which will also affect how the US sees its relationship with the Diem regime. What is known as the Buddhist Crisis in the South occurred from May to September 1963. As we've mentioned a few times in the series, Diem and his family were from the minority Catholic population. It is one of the reasons he was so appealing to the US public when he visited Washington in 1957. Now, contrary to what is perhaps the oversimplified version of events characterizing Diem's regime and nation building after Geneva, it is not as if he completely disregarded the Buddhist population as a nuisance or as something to be completely pushed out. The Ngo family had initially spent quite a bit of time and effort to get the southern Buddhists on side in the new republic. Some had been promoted to high positions, and the General Buddhist Association had been allowed to operate and establish a headquarters. Diem had also weakened two Buddhist sects, the Cao Dai and Hua Hao, upon coming to power originally, something which I guess we could say orthodox Vietnamese Buddhists were happy to go along with. He had also welcomed the 200,000 or so Buddhists that had migrated from North Vietnam, escaping the communist rule there, into South Vietnam. As Christopher Gosha states, quote, "If anything, it was cooperation which characterized the first 5 years of relations between the Buddhist Church and Diem's government." End quote. So what happened in 1963? Well, unsurprisingly, there were decades of events and circumstances which contextualized the so-called Buddhist crisis. Now, there's a great paper by Edward Miller titled Religious Revival and the Politics of Nation Building, Reinterpreting the 1963 Buddhist Crisis, where he contends that the crisis was not simply about religious freedom, a political conspiracy, or particularly, in the case of Quang Duc's self-immolation, a result of some manifestation of ancient beliefs and customs. Rather, he says that primarily it can be thought of as a combination of circumstance, personalities, and agendas, which more broadly can be considered a clash between different visions of how the nation of South Vietnam was being built. An important historical force that needs to be touched on was the growth of what is known as the Vietnamese Buddhist Revival movement. To put it simply, this was a movement that grew in the 1920s that not only sought to re-establish Buddhist principles in Vietnam, but also sort of absorbed elements of Vietnamese nationalism, and even protest and anti-colonialism within it. Buddhist nationalism is a very interesting thing. I spent a fair bit of my undergrad thesis discussing it in relation to Cambodia and Myanmar, and I always came across the same phrase when researching Buddhism in both these countries. And now, in looking into this Buddhist crisis in Vietnam, there would always be a quote from at least one person from all of these countries that said something along the lines of, well, to be Cambodian, or Burmese, or Vietnamese is to be Buddhist. And that's a fairly handy way to encapsulate that combination of nationalism and religious identity, that the two are fundamentally linked in these cases. Now, nationalism and religion, well, these are sources of that political energy that we've shown in the series to be profoundly energizing. I mean, look around even today. You ask why people do some pretty extreme things, and the likelihood that someone will respond in some way that could be linked to a sense of nationalism or religiosity are pretty high. Even in a more secular society, you will sometimes see political movements imbued with a quasi-religious terminology, as if that space where the battery had been was replaced by something that looks and functions like a battery, but has been replaced by secular terminology. And in this instance, where we are combining nationalist energy and quite fervent religious energy, well, it's a very potent combination. But to return to this Buddhist revival movement, as I said, it sort of evolves in the 20s and seeks to imbue the future of Vietnam with the prominence of Buddhism. Now, if you think of the circumstances in South Vietnam in the early 60s, Diem has a very certain vision of what this new country is going to be. He has a brand. By 1963, this brand is going to come into direct competition with what an increasingly politicized Vietnamese Buddhist movement considers its own brand. It's an oversimplification to go straight back to that line that I used before, but if we are superficially saying that this Vietnamese Buddhist revival might have the motto of "to be Vietnamese is to be Buddhist," then that is going to rub up the wrong way with Diem's moves to prop up the Catholic minority, and to invite this minority into a disproportionate degree of power in the new state, naturally with he and his Catholic family at the apex. Like other Buddhist nationalist movements, particularly in Burma, the revival centered a mix of Vietnamese nationalism with historical references to kinds of golden periods of Vietnamese history that were thought to be much more reliant on Buddhism as opposed to Taoism or Confucianism, and that the influence of these forces were in part responsible for the falling into the orbit of, French imperialism, a collapse, a degradation. As Edward Miller says, quote, "The prescriptive implications of this Buddhist historical narrative were clear. If the Vietnamese nation was to recover the independence and prosperity it had lost, it would have to return to the Buddhist principles and practices it had once embraced. It would also be necessary for Vietnamese Buddhist leaders and teachers to regain the positions of esteem and influence they had formerly enjoyed." End quote. That vision of the Vietnamese nation was not mixing well with, by the early 60s, perceptions, mostly accurate and sometimes less charitable, that Diem was increasingly showing favoritism to the Catholic community. Prominent Vietnamese Buddhists began openly criticizing this. What compounded problems further is that one of the most powerful members of the Ngo family, Ngo Dinh Duc, had become the Archbishop of Hue, which was thought to be a kind of heartland for Vietnamese Buddhism. They felt that this might be part of a wider effort to impose Christianity on the region. Hue would become the location that this Buddhist crisis began on the 8th of May, 1963. On the celebrations of that springtime Buddhist celebration known in English as Vesak Day, an incident occurred wherein large and enthusiastic crowds of faithful Buddhists came up directly against the security apparatus of the Diem Regime. So again, very large festival, thousands of people, but within that crowd there were some who were using it as an opportunity to, project the kind of Buddhist angst against the regime. There were some banners about religious discrimination they were facing and that they were struggling for religious freedom against the cruelty of the regime in this regard. Tensions flared later that day when a radio broadcast that was supposed to take place for the Buddhists in attendance went unplayed because the officials at the station felt that the recording had not been sufficiently vetted and cleared by censors. When the broadcast did not occur, many of those in the crowd which had formed around the radio station hoping to hear it on loudspeakers began to grow rather restless. They began shouting for it to begin. Some protesters looked like they might even storm the radio station. One even climbed on top of the building and replaced the South Vietnamese flag with the international Buddhist flag. As the night went on, a number of Vietnamese army soldiers and police arrived at the radio station, or rather, at the outskirts of the crowd around the radio station. They had intended to simply disperse the crowd, first via, telling them to disperse, and when that didn't work, fire hoses were used. This did not have an ideal effect either. They then edged an armoured vehicle through the crowd to try to get to the radio station, flanked by officers and soldiers. And when they were within about 10 meters of the station, something happened. There was one or more loud explosions, and several gunshots rang out. The crowd scattered, and in the aftermath, police discovered a number of people who had died. 7 died at the scene. 2 more were seriously injured and died soon after. They were between the ages of 12 and 20. South Vietnamese officials claimed that it must have been the communists, but there was no evidence to really support this. The Diem regime then made a series of missteps that would exacerbate the situation. As angry young monks, nuns, and lay Buddhists took to the streets, Diem issued orders banning the flying of religious flags. Even though this included Catholic flags, the Buddhist leaders interpreted this as yet another attack on their religion. While the events at the radio station don't seem like they were premeditated, more likely the result of inefficient crowd control and extremely poor judgment by those trying to secure the location that day, the way that this could all be interpreted set the cork out of the bottle, and the rage flowed. In late May, negotiations between Buddhist leaders and members of the Diem regime had gotten nowhere. On the 30th, a group of 400 monks and nuns converged upon the National Assembly building in Saigon. After sitting in the lotus position for hours, singing and chanting, they then moved to the Buddhist Association headquarters and began a 48-hour hunger strike. Similar protests occurred in Hue, where the aftermath of the killings was still keenly felt. Local authorities responded with a kind of siege mentality. Police and soldiers roamed the streets, and electricity and water was cut off to the areas in which the protesters were congregating. On the 3rd of June, this saw another clash between the state and the Buddhists, where out-of-date tear gas was used, which caused more damage than was expected, and many were hospitalized. Efforts to negotiate took another hit on the 8th of June, when Madame Nu, the wife of Diem's brother Ngo Dinh Nhu, who was kind of like the second most powerful and closest to Diem in the regime. Also, I realized I'd mistakenly in the last episode referred to Madame Nu as Diem's wife. Apologies. Diem was a lifelong bachelor, and therefore due to her proximity, she kind of became the de facto First Lady of Vietnam, even though she was married to his brother. She was quite controversial, to say the least, and in this statement that she makes through a government organization known as the Women's Solidarity Movement, she goes quite out of line on a few things that was only going to make things worse. She claimed that the protesters were committing treason, that using hunger strikes was like blackmail, that the robes they were wearing doesn't make them monks. Now, apparently Diem didn't even know it was going to be published, so he hadn't exactly approved it, and probably would have liked to keep negotiating with the Buddhists without this kind of statement coming out, which could basically be seen as coming from the presidential palace. But importantly, he didn't publicly denounce it after it was published either. So what did that say to the Buddhists? Well, it confirmed in their minds the kinds of discrimination they had always assumed characterized the South Vietnamese leadership. The refusal of Diem to denounce Madame Nu's statement after a few days, well, that led them to think that negotiations were pointless, and that perhaps a more dramatic form of protest would need to be employed. And here we reintroduce Quang Duc. He was in his mid-60s and had in fact 2 weeks prior to Madame Nu's denunciation of the protests already offered to the Buddhist Association to voluntarily take his own life via self-immolation. At that time, they had not accepted the offer, but now they quickly reconsidered. The Buddhist Association hastily began organizing an event to take place the next day, on the 11th of June, at the end of a monastic procession through downtown Saigon. One of the spokesmen of the Buddhist Association called several foreign journalists, saying that something important was going to happen, but without any more specifics. As we said, one of the journalists that would arrive would be the Associated Press photographer Malcolm Browne. The next day, once Quang Duc had emerged from the gathered crowd, serenely positioned himself, was doused with fuel and struck that match upon himself. As the microphone repeated the phrase, "A Buddhist monk becomes a martyr," as the oily smoke and stench engulfed the area, the Buddhist Crisis became international news. Malcolm Browne's photos, which, as we discussed, have become this sort of immortalized image, produced a shockwave that far outsized the expectations of those that had organized this horrific protest. More than anything else, the images demanded explanation. Was it an homage to ancient Buddhist practices of self-immolation that could be traced to classical Mahayana texts? Was it a demand for religious freedom? Was it a modern form of political activism about peace and human rights? Or was it an expression of anti-American sentiment about the intervention in South Vietnam? Well, here I will defer to Edward Miller's analysis. Quote, "All of these interpretations are plausible, and the various motives they ascribe to Quang Duc, religious freedom, Buddhist traditional practice, anti-war convictions, probably did play a part in his decision to burn himself. To a remarkable extent, however, almost all of the authors who have attempted to fathom Quang Duc's motives have done so without making reference to his life history or his actions prior to his death. They have overlooked important information and sources, including 2 key texts in which he explains why he was willing to die by fire. These sources, when read in conjunction with his biography, suggest that he understood his self-immolation as the culmination of his lifelong efforts to promote Buddhist unity and the reformist ideals of the Vietnamese Buddhist revival." End quote. Miller goes on to highlight some of this evidence, like in his initial proposal to sacrifice himself to the Buddhist Association. Quang Duc stated that, quote, The spirit of Buddhism is bound together with the spirit of the nation. When Buddhism prospers, the nation prospers. When Buddhism declines, the nation declines. History has demonstrated this point clearly." End quote. So, yeah, that's right in line with what we've discussed about the Buddhist nationalism within that movement, isn't it? Quang Duc had also written about restoration of Buddhism to national primacy, that Vietnamese Buddhism is everlasting, and that the Buddhist flag must not be suppressed. His final letter before his death did make concerns about religious freedom clear, as well as issues of the security crackdown that was occurring during the crisis, and to Buddhist traditions and peace. But Miller claimed that first and foremost his sacrifice was best explained through nationalism and spiritual convictions, or as I might put it, that potent mix of political energy resulting from the combination of religious and nationalistic ideology. Quang Duc's self-immolation did not bridge the gap in negotiations between the Buddhists and the Diem regime either. Although Diem was apparently shaken by what had happened, he began to view the Buddhist protests with even more suspicion, becoming convinced that the communists must be behind this, that no one would have done that voluntarily, that he must have been drugged. Instead of ending the crisis, it only got worse, particularly in light of more callous comments on behalf of Madame Nu.
What have the Buddhist leaders done comparatively? The only thing they have done, they have barbecued one of their monks, whom they have intoxicated, whom they have abused the confidence. And even that barbecuing was done not even with self-sufficient means, because they use imported gasoline.
Which, yeah, that's not going to help anything. Diem, under advice from his brother, Nu, decided that the Buddhists were looking to challenge the authority of the state of Vietnam. They cracked down even harder on the protesters. More monks self-immolated. In August, Diem would enlarge the crackdowns by seizing hundreds of pagodas and arresting hundreds, perhaps thousands of Buddhists. In a rambling interview with an American journalist, Diem claimed that the Buddhists didn't want a solution anymore, that there must be Viet Cong in the pagodas, that the government had to take a hard line or else the protesters would become even more radical, that in the middle of a war, he could not let disorder in the street continue. It symbolized Diem's unwillingness to let any group in Vietnam rival his power, and that his vision for Vietnam's future alone was the correct path forward. On the back of the strategic hamlets, the nepotism, and now this highly visible crackdown on the Buddhists and the kinds of protests that Quang Duc had started, the regime had alienated most of the South Vietnamese population. At the same time, the NLF was expanding its control over large areas of the country. American confidence in the Diem regime hit an all-time low, and some within the higher ranks of the South Vietnamese police and army began informing US officials that they no longer supported Diem. Perhaps more importantly from a US perspective, they also received word that some within Diem's administration were pondering the possibility of making direct contact with Hanoi in order to reach a settlement, without the facilitation of their American benefactors. The implications of this were massive. As Gosha explains, quote, "The Americans concluded that the Ngo family had become a threat to their wider strategic interests. Like Nguyen Van Tin, the president of the Republic of Cochin, China, who had dared to evoke the possibility of speaking directly to Ho Chi Minh in mid-1946, Diem did not fully grasp the extent to which the Americans were as committed as the French had been to using the southern state as a political weapon to preserve their interests." End quote. The writing was on the wall for Diem. Things moved quite quickly in the aftermath of the crackdown on the pagodas. Some South Vietnamese generals had responded to this issue directly by reaching out to US officials to voice their unwillingness to keep following Diem. Initially, the US response was carved out of the idea that perhaps most of this mess could be blamed on the amount of power that Diem seemed to be sharing with his brother Nu, that the failures of the strategic hamlets could also be placed on his shoulders. The response US officials gave to these army generals, via the new American ambassador, Henry Cabot Lodge, went further than just removing New from the picture. Cabot Lodge was informed that Diem must be given a chance to get rid of New, and that he be replaced by competent members of the military, or a competent politician. But if Diem will not comply, then they would need to face the possibility that he as well would be removed. They informed the relevant generals that they would be supported by the US in, quote, any interim period of breakdown in central government control, which is a fancy way of saying in the event of a coup. On August 27th, the communication became more precise. Cabot Lodge thought it would be pointless to go to Diem first and say he had to get rid of his brother, that the generals would need to be informed directly without Diem's knowledge. They were told that the Americans would be prepared to go ahead without the Ngo brothers, and that, quote, it is in effect up to them whether to keep him. This was, well, the cat was out of the bag, so to speak. Almost immediately after these back and forth communications, which Kennedy had been privy to and acknowledged and went ahead with, but some of his administration had not, like McNamara, like Maxwell Taylor, there was kind of like a cold feet thing going on. I think that's the appropriate way of putting it. Kennedy felt that he had been pressed too hard and too fast, and that in light of some new advice, that the late August communications had gone too far. Kennedy and his team tried to pull back from the brink here. Nothing happened just yet. But there is this real division between everyone involved about what the next step should be. McNamara and Taylor travelled to Saigon in September, trying to get a sense of the best course of action. They informed Kennedy that the best thing to do would be to finally put some real, genuine pressure on Diem to course correct, and to engage in the reforms that everyone had been wanting him to do for years. In the background, moves toward a coup had been continuing, both on behalf of the South Vietnamese generals wishing to enact it, as well as a select few CIA agents. Kennedy was trying to organize basically the threat of turning off the funding for Diem if he didn't come into line. There were also back and forth messages about not actively promoting a coup, but being ready and keeping on top of the situation if one occurred. The Pentagon Papers also revealed that there was a need for plausible deniability of US involvement if anything happened. Meanwhile, Cabot Lodge was strongly encouraging moving against Diem, basically saying that by October, he wouldn't be able to delay or discourage a coup. What emerges from the Pentagon Papers about the coup is almost another microcosm of the whole Vietnam experience with the US up until this point. There is equivocating on what to do. There are some who say it's definitely the thing to do, some who disagree. There is even a chance here that, for the US, once they had enacted direct financial consequences on Diem's regime, to have just said, you know what, let's reassess the whole situation here. Maybe we should just abandon this altogether, which of course they didn't do. No, almost step by step there was some contact with those plotting the coup and words of support coming to them from people like Cabot Lodge. Kennedy did it. Again, the discussions were had, the opinions were shared, but the direction of travel was hardly interrupted. There are a few exchanges between Diem and Cabot Lodge in late October, which kind of show where the relationship had gotten to. In a fully tense atmosphere, with Diem no doubt somehow aware that things were moving beneath his feet, he and Lodge had a meeting on the 27th. It was described as a fruitless and frustrating discussion. I'll paraphrase the Pentagon Papers here. Basically, in this meeting, Diem inquired about the suspension of US aid. Cabot Lodge replied by asking about the release of hundreds of arrested Buddhists and student demonstrators, and about reopening schools that had been shut by the regime out of a fearful reaction to further crisis. Apparently, Diem offered excuses and complaints in return. Finally, the US ambassador said, quote, Mr. President, every single specific suggestion which I have made, you have rejected. Isn't there some one thing you may think of that is within your capabilities to do, and that would favourably impress US opinion? The ambassador said that Diem simply gave him a blank look and changed the subject. These were the final days. The coup was imminent. Now, it should be said here that there is both a hands-off kind of thing happening here, but also a deep involvement, particularly by Cabot Lodge. Everything he was replying back to Washington, especially anything that was urging delay or caution or trying to open up a new channel of communication, like anything coming from Washington saying, hey, is there anything else we can do here? Lodge is basically saying back, this is happening, all right? It's also worth saying that the Americans were making arrangements for, when necessary, to give some kind of asylum for senior officials of the regime, including Diem. They didn't want him to die. There is a lot of worrying about whether this would succeed, what they would do if it didn't, constantly asking Lodge to make sure this goes well, if it is going to happen. On November 1st, with those plotting in the South Vietnamese military securing their positions and building their forces, preparing their assault, they made their move. At 1:30 in the afternoon, they seized police headquarters, radio stations, the airport, and other important locations. They then moved against the Presidential Palace and the Special Forces barracks. In just a few hours, all resistance had been swatted aside, except for inside the Presidential Palace itself. There was no one coming to help Diem and his brother. That night, holed up in some part of his final stronghold, Diem phoned Ambassador Lodge. The transcript of their call remains. Diem begins by saying, quote, "Some units have made a rebellion, and I want to know, what is the attitude of the US?" Lodge replies, "I do not feel well enough informed to be able to tell you. I've heard the shooting, but I'm not acquainted with all the facts. Also, it's 4:30 a.m. in Washington, and the US government cannot possibly have a view." Diem then says, "But you must have some general ideas. After all, I am chief of state. I have tried to do my duty. I want to do now what duty and good sense require. I believe in duty above all." To which Lodge says in response, "You have certainly done your duty. As I told you only this morning, I admire your courage and your great contribution to your country. No one can take away from you the credit for all you have done. Now, I am worried about your physical safety. I have a report that those in charge of the current activity offer you and your brother safe conduct out of the country if you resign. Had you heard this?" Diem says, "No." "You have my phone number?" And Lodge says, "Yes. If I can do anything for your physical safety, please call me." To which Diem finally says, "I am trying to re-establish order." And the call ends. It seems that Diem had never known that he was speaking to the US official who had perhaps more than anyone else helped orchestrate his removal from power. Diem and his brother will escape the presidential palace early in the morning before it was completely surrendered. Apparently, he was in contact with the generals throughout the night who kept urging him to surrender and that he would be given safe conduct to the airport to leave Vietnam. At 6:20 in the morning, he finally agreed. Diem and his brother Nu were eventually tracked down by the coup leaders. After being pulled into an armoured vehicle, both of them were soon shot to death. Less than 3 weeks later, Kennedy would also meet his end, also a victim of an assassin's bullet. On the 4th of November, Cabot Lodge cabled Washington saying that he felt the coup would help shorten the war against the Viet Cong, that the country and military would be invigorated by the removal of Diem. However, Viet Cong activity only got worse, and it was discovered just how badly the strategic Hamlet program had been going. It had been obfuscated by those friendly to the Diem government. The new Chief of State, General Min, met with Lodge soon after. Lodge said he seemed tired and somewhat frazzled, but was obviously a good and well-intentioned man. He asked in his reporting back to Washington, will he be strong enough to get on top of things? The answer was no. Within 3 months, another coup occurred, beginning what is usually referred to as a kind of revolving door of different generals for years. The Kennedy administration had assumed that the coup might help them form a more stable relationship with South Vietnam, but their involvement in it only further entangled them into a growing mess. Now, one question which always comes up and has been argued about for decades is whether Kennedy would have taken the same actions as his successor, Lyndon Johnson, in undertaking a full-scale land war in South Vietnam and reliance on air power against Hanoi directly. As you might expect, on a subject that has been debated for decades, there is no definitive answer. I personally find evidence on both sides of the debate compelling. There was talk of a pullback that historians and analysts will alternatively see as proof that he wanted out, or as conversely to sort of dismiss that, as there were plenty of other things that would indicate he was going to maintain the escalation that he had started. People talk about his attitude toward history and his continual bringing up that, if it's not Vietnam's war, we're going to lose like the French. And then other people say, yeah, well, you also escalated the war to the point that it was at up until this point. I don't have much of a concrete opinion either way. What I do think all of it points to, however, is simply this issue about passing the baton from president to president or administration to administration. Vietnam seemed to get worse with each handoff. Kennedy certainly left Johnson a crisis to have to contend with, and Kennedy himself had almost by default had to continue what was left by Eisenhower in 1961. Again, it comes back to what we spoke about in the last episode, this paradox of Vietnam. We will not be excluding the events that I think herald the dawn of the so-called Vietnam War in future episodes. But I think for now, it's time to return briefly to the focus of this series. A few months prior to the Buddhist Crisis in South Vietnam in March 1963, Sihanouk was dealing with what he considered to be a kind of mini-crisis, a perceived challenge to his rule and evidence of some kind of subversion. Student protests had broken out in Siem Reap, and Sihanouk had blamed some of his old adversaries for this. In his trademark penchant for the dramatic, he returned from China and began pointing fingers. At the same time, his, at the time, trusted right-wing defense minister Lon Nol had drawn up a list of 34 known subversive leftist individuals. Some were even members of parliament, like Khieu Samphan. Sihanouk accused them publicly of trying to overthrow his government. Some on this list also ranked rather high in the recently reorganised membership of the Khmer Workers' Party, the antecedent of the Communist Party of Kampuchea. Salot Sa was on this list, as was Yang Sari, but this secret membership was not realised. Rather, they were included due to their reputation as leftist schoolteachers in Phnom Penh. Sihanouk summoned all of those on the list to an audience with himself. He lambasted them for not taking responsibility for their actions, and, again in rather dramatic fashion, said that if they were so great, perhaps they should form government. Naturally, they refused this somewhat rhetorical gesture and pledged their loyalty to him. Sihanouk allowed most of them to resume whatever work they had, including cabinet members like Khieu Samphan. Salot Sa, however, did not attend this meeting. Having recently been voted to the top position of the Cambodian Communist Party, he was concerned that his public-facing identity, the caring, mild-mannered teacher Salot Sa, as opposed to the revolutionary in the shadows, Pol, was now suddenly a visible target. Even if they didn't know his true identity, it was feared that further scrutiny of the public identity could expose the secret identity and the whole movement. On the 31st of March, Salot Sa, who we will now only refer to as Pol and eventually Pol Pot, made the decision to return to the jungles. Abandoning the pretense of a double life, he would now completely assume his revolutionary title and position as leader of a movement which sought to overthrow the Cambodian government. He, and soon followed by Yang Sari and Son Sen, would return to the roots of the movement, the jungles on the border with Vietnam, like the Khmer Viet Minh had done, like Sa himself had done in 1953. He would no longer be constrained by the need to maintain a public persona. No more teaching duties, no more connections to his family. But there is a perhaps deeper way of looking at this as well. Philip Short writes in his biography of Pol Pot, quote, The communist leaders were rational men. The decision to rebase in the countryside marked the same kind of tactical retreat that the Chinese Politburo had made in abandoning Shanghai in 1933 and the Vietnamese when they left Hanoi in 1946. But Sa and his companions were not Chinese or Vietnamese. They were Khmer. Outwardly, the Cambodian Revolution was returning to its roots, but psychologically, the transition was more complex. In Khmer thought, the fundamental dichotomy is not between good and evil, as it is in Judeo-Christian societies, but between Srok and Brai, village and forest. Subconsciously, the center of gravity of the revolution had shifted from the civilized regions, the towns and settlements, where man dominated nature, to the jungles, the wild places, where dark, unknown forces roamed, and, throughout the centuries, sages, the original Khmer of Cambodian antiquity, had repaired to seek spiritual power. End quote. Again, just a reminder of the kind of different influences on a movement which might on the surface seem like another revolutionary party. We will continue to explore these differences in the coming episodes. But in any case, it took a day for Pol to get from Phnom Penh to an area near Kampong Cham and Kreche, where he then walked for a day into the dark forests to a Viet Cong encampment just over the border in Vietnam. Soon, near the still ostensibly superior Vietnamese comrades, they would have their own base of operations, Office 100. And although this location would change many times over the next 12 years, Pol would not return to Phnom Penh until the Khmer Rouge were in control of the entire country. Just as South Vietnam began to take on an extended period of chaos, the Cambodian communists were now going to plan their own hostile takeover, their own war, their own revolution.